Welcome, everyone, to our second public information meeting for the Ulster County Area Transit Route Optimization Plan. My name is Brian Slack. I'm Principal Transportation Planner for the Ulster County Transportation Council, and I'm acting as project manager tonight for this effort. We're here with Jared Toops from Foursquare ITP, who is our consultant to lead this effort, where we're looking at all elements of UCAT operations to re-examine their effectiveness and promulgate some solutions for improved service that we hope to see implemented in the near term in Ulster County to improve the system for riders in Ulster County. Some of the factors that led to this effort include there's been quite a lead up that got us here. In 2019, working with, again, UCTC, Ulster County Area Transit, took over operations of Kingston City Bus. And since that point in time, there have been quite a few disruptions that we've all had to face in dealing with trying to improve transit service in Ulster County. This service changes that we promulgated in 2019 were not well received by the public for a variety of reasons. And then we slowly drifted into the pandemic. The many challenges associated with dealing with operating a public transit system during a pandemic. We've also had since then significant driver shortages, as well as significant changes in demographics. So it's very timely and good that we return to this topic and see what our riders, what the general public has in mind in terms of what a responsive and effective transit service means to them. And we'll be going forward and working on the project over the course of the next 6 months, roughly 6 to 8 months, and hope to have strong recommendations by the end of the year. I'd like to just briefly go around the room and do some brief introductions, and then I'll hand the floor over to Jared. Start with you.
I am Tony Rozier. I'm the director at Ulster County Area Transit.
I am Tony Trosha, Deputy Director of Ulster County. And I'm Dennis Doyle, the Ulster County Planning Director, and also the Director of the Ulster County Transportation Council.
Dave Stoss, Senior Transportation Planner with the Ulster County Transportation Council.
Tanya Garment, guest.
Thank you. Jared, the floor is yours, then we'll take questions at the end.
Great. All right. Thank you for coming, everyone. So there we go. Here's our agenda. We just got through some introductions. We'll briefly go over kind of the project and background, dive a bit more into how we got here, like Brian was talking about. And then the bulk of the presentation is divided kind of into 3 sections. We're going to present our preliminary findings on the market analysis, which looks a lot at kind of where people and jobs, where we think demand is located. And that's going to be kind of the bulk of the content we see. We have a smaller section on the service analysis, which, as opposed to looking at demand for transit, looks at the supply, the current UCAT routes, how they're operating, where they're being used, things like that. Finally, we'll go briefly into kind of overview of our engagement for this project, what's happened so far, and what you can expect moving forward. That'll lead into next steps, and then at the end, an open forum. So we have a few objectives for this meeting. This is really mostly an introduction, getting public visibility. We want to summarize a lot of preliminary findings from the market and service analyses so that the public's very clear on kind of the inputs we use when we do service planning, like all the pieces that kind of in play. We have a transit survey that's been open for a little more than a month now that we've been getting a great response rate from. We're at like 430 plus responses. It's still going to be open through the middle of July. And so we want to take this as an extra opportunity to re-promote it and really try to get some extra feedback in these next few weeks. And then finally, just going to provide an overview of how the project evolves from here, kind of all the next steps, just being very transparent about all this data and feedback we're collecting. what we're gonna do with it. So introductions, like Brian sort of alluded to, we've got both UCTC, the Ulster County Transportation Council, with Brian, Dennis, and David, working directly with UCAT, Ulster County Area Transit, and that is Tony and Tony. And then my name is Jared Toops. I'm with Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. We have a sub-consultant assisting with the latter part of this project, and we really specialize in local transit planning and have a portfolio across the country, but particularly on the eastern seaboard. So let's move into the background and project goals. So this graph you see here is monthly ridership for UCAT for about the past decade. So it's a bar graph. The higher the line, the higher your ridership. The majority of it is fixed route service, which is what we see as like traditional a bus line that goes from point A to point B. The smaller blue parts that are barely perceptible represent demand response service, something that you call and schedule out. For UCAT, that's mostly the paratransit. So in 2012, UCAT conducted its 2012 TDP, or Transit Development Plan, which is just kind of an overview of potential service changes. In that time, like that 2 years following up, they saw like a 20% increase in ridership, which is a really good story to tell. And that's where we saw our pre-2019 peak in ridership in the fall of 2014. After that period, it was a relative plateau. You see those sort of mountains and valleys. That's very typical with seasonal. You typically have higher ridership in the winter or summer, or they tend to follow like holidays. Very small decrease over time. And then UCAT absorbed Kingston City Bus in 2019. And that's where we see our nice ridership high that then plummets in March of 2020. Like every transit agency in the country, the pandemic really just hit us hard. Since then, it's kind of been a slow and steady recovery over the last 3 years. It was during this time that UCAT decided to go fare free in October of 2022, which is an element of this recovery story. No fares mean more people have the means to run. So moving forward, how do we look at the future? What's next? We're aware of ongoing housing affordability issues in Ulster County. More people who already are somewhat limited in their means being priced out of being very closely located to jobs and opportunities. So we have to make a transit system that's aware that these connections, these longer trips, are kind of becoming a factor in how people get around. We also know about industry rapid advancements in microtransit. So as an alternative to your traditional fixed route bus system. And I'll get into a bit more detail on microtransit in minutes. Finally, the county has a goal of a fully electric fleet by 2035. And this does require some thinking ahead because really it's not as simple as just start buying electric buses instead of conventional fuel. They're significantly more expensive, but they also have different infrastructure and service requirements to where they do require some actual thought on how the routes are structured and operated. So the project has 4 main goals. We want to increase ridership and see an increase in mode share, or the percentage of people using transit in the county. We want to develop recommendations that are more ready to be transitioned into a fleet, an electric fleet. A lot of that's on the back end of how they're scheduled, but it's still important to think ahead and make sure the recommendations are easily transitioned over. We want to embrace new micro-mobility models like microtransit where appropriate. This technology has made a lot of advancements in the last 5-10 years. We want to see if it's the right fit for parts of the county. It may not be, but this is an opportunity for us to take a bit more of a deeper dive to say what explicitly would it look like, and is that something we want to pursue? And then finally, the 4th goal is we want to adopt a new technology platform to operate and monitor UCAT's services. For UCAT's sort of data tracking on the scheduling, bus location, and ridership. It's kind of a grouping of software right now. We want to see if maybe there's something that's more user-friendly for staff, kind of have an all-in-one comprehensive package so that data tracking can just be easier. So I mentioned microtransit, but what is microtransit? An official definition is a technology-enabled transit service that typically uses multi-passenger or pooled shuttles or vans to provide on-demand or fixed scheduled services with either dynamic or fixed route. That's a lot. But how I'm taking this is that transit agencies have traditionally operated smaller shuttles that people request. Sometimes called dial rides, air transit. That's been happening for decades. But typically have relied on people calling ahead, sometimes days ahead, to schedule a very specific ride to a very specific place. Microtransit is trying to bring this more into the mainstream. It often involves like a website or a smartphone application to where people can request a service similar to like Uber or Lyft, but it's a public vehicle, a public bus driver, and may or may not be shared. So like this is an example of a microtransit vehicle. They're going to be smaller than your typical bus, but sometimes more appropriate depending on the number of people you need to serve. And looking at microtransit, this isn't new in Ulster County. It's sort of come up because for a lot of agencies that serve areas that are lower density or more rural, it can be a way to maintain service, but be more strategic with your resources. So the Connect Mid-Hudson study, 2021, which looked at the entire wider region, identified some preliminary microtransit opportunities. And these were just sort of high-level high region areas that should be explored and refined further for microtransit. Ulster County also applied for a grant from the state a few years back, the state's Clean Neighborhood Challenge, the funding of which would have gone to a microtransit pilot. They were not successful, but we've seen like the dialogue is not new to Ulster County, and we really want to take it a step further of looking, are there specific zones we think should be operated? So when we think about service design, actually creating transit routes, there's kind of four big inputs into service design process. The first being the market analysis, kind of where people live, where they need to go, the demand side. The service analysis, looking at the existing routes, which ones are performing better, not performing so well, even variations within the route. Public engagement. We have our survey, we have our public meetings. We've been meeting with operators as well and UCAT staff to get sort of that qualitative observation, qualitative of what do you think is working or not working on certain routes to kind of fill the gaps where data can't provide the whole picture. And then finally, industry best practice in terms of adequate layover facilities for buses, making sure that the schedule can be maintained, just overall trying to plan effective service. So the first piece is our market analysis. The market analysis is comprised of 4 pieces. Transit potential. This is really looking at density of where people and jobs are and how many of them are in the area. Typically, higher density means you can have support more transit. Propensity dives a little bit further into the demographic data to say we know certain demographic groups or certain job types are more likely to need or use transit. Where do those groups live? So it's kind of looking a bit more critically than just density. Travel patterns, we have data sets that can look at kind of the main travel patterns within an area to kind of see what are the major points that a lot of people in Ulster County are trying to go. What are the big movements in the county? Because our system should be, if not an exact match to that, a decent approximation. And then finally, microtransit suitability. We really kind of combine transit potential and transit propensity to get a sense of where traditional fixed route service could be more appropriate or where we should look at things like microtransit. And I'll get a bit more into that in a bit. So transit potential, it's mainly a density. Generally, a higher density, whether jobs or people, is going to support higher transit, whether that's more frequent service or higher capacity service. So transit potential specifically is a measure of the number of people or jobs per acre. So this map shows the transit potential in Ulster County with the light green colors indicating lower potential and lower density. As you get into the warmer colors with the red, higher potential or higher density. And probably not a big surprise to anyone who lives here. Kingston and New Paltz are the primary areas of density in Ulster County. So propensity, again, kind of looks at everything else on the demographic side. Propensity itself means a natural inclination or tendency. So we're looking at certain subgroups in the population or job types that we know are more inclined to need or use transit. So our entire transit propensity methodology is built on 4 different indices that look at certain population and employment characteristics that are associated with higher need and higher transit ridership. So this graphic kind of shows these 4 indices in concept and how they're related. So the first is transit-oriented populations. And this is an emphasis on demographic groups that we specifically associate with more likely to rely on transit for everyday needs, lower income, 0 1-car households, the elderly, people of color. And they're one of sort of like our 2, if you think about like origin groups. So for transit-oriented populations, when we look at where they live, where we see concentrations, we also know that these are people who probably need transit for all of their trips. They don't have the luxury of a car, at least not regularly. So they're going to need it to get to work, home-based trips, home-based work trips. They're going to need it to run errands or go to the doctor, home-based other trips, or on their way home from work, they might need to stop at the store and grab something for dinner. So those are those non-home-based trips in the blue, yellow, and red. These people less likely to have the luxury of choice and very much rely on the service. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, we have commuter populations. And these are groups that we think, you know what, if the route is convenient and congestion is bad, we can probably pull them in to commute in the morning, commute out in the evening, if they work like a traditional 9 to 5. So they're going to be like a good target for these home-based work trips. If they need to go to a doctor's office or something, or want to go somewhere weekend, they're probably going to drive. There's probably very little we can do to like make transit really attractive for them. So those 2 groups kind of look at the origin side of things. On the destination side, we look at general employment centers, areas with lots of jobs, because we get people trying to get to work. A transit connection to jobs is important. And then finally, service activity centers. This is kind of everything else. Your doctor's offices, your recreation centers, public services, entertainment. So not only is that capturing people who need to access all of those services as consumers, but also if you work somewhere like that, you're more likely to work a non-traditional schedule. You might work 6 a.m. to 2 or 1 p.m. to 10. And so it's very much just as much, those are employment areas, but not your traditional 9 to 5 sense. So our findings with transit propensity, again, Kingston and New Paltz are where we're going to see the highest kind of propensity throughout all 4 of these indices. That's to be expected. Urban areas are going to have it because they're still influenced by density and like the availability of services. Ellenville, Woodstock, Saugerties, Highland, we see like some moderate propensity in the transit-oriented index, which tells us again, we're seeing more concentrations of groups who are going to rely on transit for a lot of their travel needs. And then finally, the rest of Ulster County, pretty low propensity across all 4 indices. Lots of rural areas, like unless they have very high concentrations of certain groups, are going to show up on the lower scale. So again, similar to the density map, the green is going to indicate lower, while the warmer colors indicate higher. This is just the transit-oriented population map, but the other 3 maps show pretty similar results as well. So we have our potential, our density, and we have our propensity, which is like our need. And we put those together to kind of take a first shot at microtransit. When you have a high need for transit, people really are counting on it to get places, but the transit potential or the density is low. Traditional fixed route service is not going to perform well. Either you're going to have to put a lot of money into it to make it a regular service that will not get many riders, or it's going to be super infrequent. You know, we're saying looking at headways every 2 to 3 hours. Microtransit is a potential alternative that could be a much better way to provide higher frequency service to low density areas, connecting them to either major activity centers like jobs or a commercial area, or providing an opportunity for them to transfer to some more frequent transit. You know, microtransit in your community, but also could take you to a bus stop that gets you like longer trips. So this kind of shows, if we visualize our propensity in this pink color, where the darker the pink, the higher propensity and potential for density in blue. When both are high, we see the demand and we see the need. We get a purple overlay that says fixed route service would probably do well. when only the need is high, but the density is low, this dark pink, that's areas to look at microtransit. So applying that same sort of color scheme to Ulster County, what we see is the areas most suitable for microtransit are going to be more in the western portion of the county, and then sort of select pockets in the east, getting closer to the river. It's important to note, these are not microtransit zones. These are actual, shapes are census groups and just where we have data available that we can analyze. So they are not recommendations for zones. It just sort of implies where one service type might make more sense than the other. They also aren't inherently exclusive of each other. You might have an area that it qualifies for both, depending on the actual network you design. Later in this project, as we come up with recommendations and service scenarios, we'll look at where we think fixed route transit makes sense, and if we think microtransit makes sense to complement it. Finally, we have our travel pattern methodology. We want to look at kind of the major travel patterns, both internal to the county and external to the county, to make sure that our routes are connecting major destinations lots of people are trying to go. To do this analysis, we divide the county into these zones. Most of them are based on either towns of significant towns or major corridors, like the US 209 corridor, the 9W corridor, places like that. Looking at the travel entirely within the county, this map shows lines connecting all of those zones. I showed on the previous slide with the darker and thicker lines indicating more people are going between those 2 points on the day-to-day. The yellow circles are indicative of the number of trips occurring within that zone. So within Ulster County, not super surprisingly, Kingston's kind of a major hub, either as an origin or destination for a lot of trips. We generally see the highest travel volumes kind of staying parallel to the river, going from about as far north as Socrates to about as far south as New Paltz, kind of in that north-south up and down direction, which looking at your existing routes, looking at the existing road network, that all generally matches. So yeah, Socrates and New Paltz is where we see this highest bit of sort of activity. We also looked at travel outside the county, particularly to Orange and Dutchess counties. So this is another map with sort of a color mix. Areas that are more blue are trying to make more trips into Orange County. Areas that are in pink are trying to make more trips into Dutchess. And when you see a lot of purple, that means it's kind of an even split. They're trying to get a lot of places. So the northeastern portion of the county, they're typically more likely to make their way to Dutchess County. It's closer by the bridge. And the further south you go, you have more people in this blue trying to make it into Orange County. Newburgh isn't far. And then sort of the county's core around Kingston, we're seeing a lot of these purple values, which kind of means it's an even split. We limited our analysis to Orange and Dutchess County just because of the historical proximity of major towns in those counties to where a lot of population in Ulster lives. We know people in Western Ulster are trying to go to points west, or some people in Ulster are trying to get very far north to Albany. But we want to sort of limit our scope to what we thought were reasonable distances or areas that transit could provide a connection to. So, a summary of everything I just talked about. Kingston, New Paltz, we see the highest density and the highest propensity that we associate with fixed route service. Ellenville and Highland, we see some sort of moderate values that we also think could support fixed route service. A lot of county lacks the density that's traditionally associated with fixed route service, but may have the propensity or the need to support microtransit. So this includes western portions of the county, as well as communities adjacent to major thoroughfares. Kingston and its immediate surroundings are a major market for travel patterns throughout the county. And generally we see more people trying to kind of move on the eastern half. And then finally, like I just said, the northeast is a little more oriented towards Dutchess, the southern parts towards Ulster, and the greater Kingston, New Paltz corridor is kind of an even split. So that whole thing was the market analysis, or kind of where are people trying to go, where are the jobs. We then do a service analysis to look at the existing transit what UCAT cert routes are more popular, less popular, why, things like that. So keeping to our rule of fours, there are 4 components to this. The existing service level, what kind of transit is out there right now in terms of how frequently it comes, what day it operates. Existing ridership, which routes have more ridership on an individual route? Is that ridership all over, or is it only a couple stops? Productivity, how many riders does a route serve compared to the resources required to operate it? And then finally, performance. We'll look at things like, is the route relatively on time? Or when talking with the public, when talking with operators, do we hear things about congestion or dangerous turns, things like that? So existing services. We look at service days. Some routes operate 7 days a week, some operate 6, some operate 5. It's important for us to know what areas have connections when. Same with span. When does the route start and end on a typical day? As well as frequency. How many actual trips occur each day? And then finally, service variations. Some routes will kind of do different things at different times of the day. If a facility is closed or the first trip of the day might be longer, things like that. And we look at all this, we typically summarize it just kind of in a table. For here, this is for the KPL route. Because it's important when we make recommendations that we measure, hey, have we increased? It's easy to say, oh, they have more frequent service in our proposal, but do they have the same span of service? They may not. Our proposal may be more frequent, but operate fewer hours, or maybe more. We have to be able to effectively kind of tell people this area has seen increases in service span frequency, or vice versa. We want to be very clear and cognizant of these impacts. Existing ridership. We look at ridership at the route level to kind of determine what areas of a route have higher and fewer boardings. And so this is an example map we have for the blue route in Kingston. It's showing a heat map in the background where kind of that higher yellow color indicates more ridership activity, people getting on or off the bus. So for the blue route, we see that typically Kingston Plaza, where a lot of transfers happen in the system, is going to be our biggest ridership hub that very much matches expectations. And that ridership is generally heavier kind of on that core Broadway corridor. This isn't to say that there's not other ridership at the other stops, just when you look at a very long observation window, it's this Broadway corridor to the plaza. That's really kind of the backbone. And then we're also looking at paratransit ridership, or calling existing paratransit services, just to get a sense of where that's happening as well. Route productivity. So this compares the number of passengers we serve to the resources spent operating. There's kind of 2 different numbers here. Passengers per revenue hour looks at total number of passengers divided by total number of hours spent operating the route during what we call revenue hours, which means when it's actually open for public service. Passengers per revenue mile, pretty much the same metric, but instead of looking at the number of hours, we look at the number of miles that's logged and get done. And these are really useful to kind of see, and most of the time, if passengers per revenue mile is high, hours are typically high too. Many times they're very closely correlated. But sometimes we'll see a route that has very high passengers per revenue mile, but surprisingly low per revenue hour. And in that case, what that might tell us is like, oh, the route's short and gets good ridership, but it spends so much time, maybe in traffic or getting held up, that the revenue hours we spend is actually kind of disproportionate in effect. So it can help us kind of diagnose if a route's not doing so well. Maybe is it congestion, is it length, things like that. And then finally, route performance. The main thing we look at here is on-time performance, or how often the bus shows up compared to the schedule. Because it has a major impact on riders on their perceived reliability if they won't trust, UCAT as their option. In addition to OTP, we're also using the public survey as well as operator interviews. We have a couple of areas that are more open response for people to tell us what routes do you ride, what works, what doesn't. And this is kind of our catch-all for additional qualitative variables and observation that aren't easy to capture in data. So this graphic is an example of how we can look at on-time performance as like a percentage of the route's overall observations. So, for the blue route, we see a decent portion on time, a smaller portion late. According to this, a lot of trips are early. That can kind of depend on what your definition of early is. It's typically more strict than late, but overall, we like to see if a route can maintain its schedule really well, or if something about the schedule or the alignment needs to be modified. Okay, the third part of service planning is public engagement. And this is just kind of an overview of the process so far and what you can expect moving forward. So we're in phase one. Great. This includes the transit survey, which is live through the middle of next month, these public meetings, as well as we've had some interviews with UCAT staff and operators to get their sense of what's working, what's not. And the main goal of this engagement phase is introduction, telling people about the project, showing them kind of our inputs of when we start thinking of recommendations. Phase two engagement, we're going to have two service scenarios, and these are kind of going to be high-level visions for what the UCAT network could look like in the future. One might be tweaks to the existing system. The other might be, let's start from scratch and draw all new routes. We haven't decided yet. We're going to look at data in the comments to kind of see if that nudges us in a particular direction. So these two scenarios will be presented to the public, will be presented to staff and operators, and we want to hear the good, the bad, and the ugly about what they like and don't like on each scenario. But we want that because after phase two engagement, we'll take the best from those scenarios and try to marry them into a single final scenario. This final one will be a bit more in detail of exactly when the service would operate, a bit more kind of those nitty-gritty. We'll also include another round of engagement, both with the public as well as staff. And each phase 2 and 3 would have a 30-day comment period, so people have time to digest what they've seen and provide their responses. So the big thing live right now is the transit survey. Was made live on May 6th. And as of June 11th, we've had 413 responses, which is incredible. I checked yesterday and we were over 430, and we're really happy with how that's trending. The survey is still live and can be accessed at participating Ulster. We also have on the flyer a QR code to access the survey. It's available in English and in Spanish. The survey closes on July 12th, so if you haven't filled it out already, please do. It provides a lot of really valuable input. But like, what's in it? What are we asking? We're asking about your priorities. We'll ask like, oh, would you rather see more frequency? Like would you rather see more frequent service or more weekend service? We ask people to kind of rank their priorities for what they want in a transit network. And this really just helps us understand the public's priorities in that when we come up with these scenarios. If one scenario is more frequent, but maybe has fewer routes, we can say the public told us frequency is what's most important. And this is how you achieve that. It also makes a point to really distinguish between existing riders and potential riders, because we want to see, are the priorities different? And also, if we want to grow our ridership, that means we have to find new riders, and we need to understand what's the barrier that keeps you from using UCAT services. Is it just convenience, or is it partially, you don't know about it? Is it like a visibility issue? It really helps for us to kind of differentiate between these groups, who often priorities are pretty aligned, but if they're different, we want to know why and how. So what's next? This is a more built-out version of the graphic I showed you at the beginning about the full fleshed out market analysis, service analysis, our public engagement, and industry best practices. And the point of this graphic is to really help people understand that no one map or survey comment or idea is going to single-handedly build a scenario. It can be easy to see a map about microtransit and get worried, oh, my zone is going to be, my community is going microtransit. There are so many different variables that feed into service design. It's a very iterative process with a lot of inputs, and we really just want to drive that point home. How the process is going forward is we'll take everything we've heard, everything I showed you, everything we hear from the survey when it closes, and we're going to develop these two scenarios that will be high level, but very distinctly different from each other. So it's easy to kind of see a difference. Like, wow, this one really prioritizes X, this one really prioritizes Y. We'll come back for this phase 2 engagement and get your thoughts. As we develop the final scenario, We're gonna try and marry the best of scenarios A and B, or one or two, excuse me, by incorporating the feedback we hear from phase two engagement. The final network will be a bit more fleshed out, a bit more detailed, and we're coming back from additional engagement and repeating the full process of a final network that's fully scheduled out, has a timeline for when we think UCAT can implement it, that ultimately does incorporate additional feedback from phase three engagement. So it's a very iterative process of we come up with ideas, we talk to y'all tell us what you like and don't like, and we repeat the process. Immediate next steps. Again, the survey. Very happy with our response rate. Over 400, we're seeing good representation across the county, but we always take more. Again, mid-July is when the survey will close. And then UCTC staff will also be doing some sort of one-on-one meetings with other sort of local stakeholders to just make sure that the survey is getting maximum promotion and that we're really getting all this feedback now before we start putting pens to paper. And then phase two engagement should be happening later this summer, late summer, early fall at least. And so that is me being done talking at you. So want to open the floor to Q&A. We can scroll back to any slides, or we can talk about things we haven't covered. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Do you have questions?
I do, if you want to ask yours first, because you were here for the whole thing.
We can go back and forth with all your questions, yeah. Well, okay, one that's popping out to me is the electrification of the fleet. How much are you studying? You know, how are we going to run a fleet that's hopefully more robust than we have now? Like in the winter time, situations where it can become much more complicated to run service than it is with the gas powered ones. Are you looking at that at this point?
So we're not getting so much into logistics of that, but it does, what this project does offer us is an opportunity to look at like the fundamental structure of the routes and how they lend themselves. For example, like generally my experience with other agencies is it's harder to have longer routes with electric vehicles because they don't, like the charge doesn't last as long and take longer fuel. So it might be we have to look at on average having a shorter route that returns to the garage more frequently to charge. So we look at kind of like higher level things like that, about does this system lend itself to easily transitioning? It's less about the sort of exact policies of, you know, do we have different policies in the winter about like having standby vehicles or something? My general experience also is that because electric vehicles are down for longer while they're charging compared to filling a gas tank, you need more buses to maintain the same service. And so we'll at least try to be mindful of, in a recommendation, we can estimate how many conventional vehicles it will take, but we also want to be prepared to know this number will increase by X% when it's fully electric.
And if I could add on to that response, thank you, Jared. Working with the Department of the Environment sometime around, I think it was 2021, we completed our initial electrification study, working with Creighton Manning engineers. That gave us a very broad view of the feasibility of existing routes vis-a-vis electrification based on the technology that was in place at that period of time. We really view electrification as a long-term goal, 2035, that is when we expect to have a fully electric fleet. We're gonna need all those years to get to that point. Because it's not just the fleet, it's not just the vehicles, it's the charging infrastructure. And it's also considering the size of the vehicles. And some routes will continue to prove challenging for having electric vehicles on the zebra, for example. It will always be a challenge based on what we know about current technology.
But it's our opportunity to kind of say like, okay, is there something about where the sea route goes that could make it?
Hmm.
Where
maybe
it terminates or what time of day or.
a connection point there.
Correct.
Maybe a connection point there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have definitely more questions. I'd love to go back and forth like you, if that works. Okay.
I have some questions about the survey. I found it was very heavy on the ask for demographics, and I wasn't comfortable providing, my age, my employment, my everything else. And it also seemed to push the responses to microtransit, which I'm not in favor of until we fix our transportation system. We need less cars on the road, not more, especially, I mean, now it just seems so much busier within traffic and road rage and everything else. So I'm just wondering, how some of those questions were created, if you're looking to back into a result, or if we're really looking at expanding and enhancing our routes, even though it's a very large county. I've been told that the Phoenicia and Woodstock buses are always full. So, instead of using microtransit to take people to a system that's not functioning properly, why not get our system to function first? And then we could look at a second phase.
Yeah, to your point about demographics first, we do try to make sure that people understand those are optional. That's mainly just to make sure as we're looking at our service results, if we're thinking we're getting a fair slice of the count. I've been looking at it a few times, like demographic wise, and I think for the people who responded, it's matching the county's relative demographic breakdown. So we know, okay, we're getting a decent, representation of people of color, at least relative to Ulster's whole profile. Same with things like income and age, of just like, it's not going to be a perfectly representative sample from like a statistics perspective, but it's important for us to understand that, we have all these people saying that they want, let's say all the people are saying they really want microtransit because but then we look like, the average income of this survey was over $100,000 or something like, that might be a weird skewed response. So it helps us just contextualize if there's kind of any obvious screwiness in the demographic data that we think is not representative. That just helps us contextualize before we take the survey to heart. Like, keep in mind. It wasn't designed, I think, to prioritize microtransit or push people. I think what we try to help people understand is in a limited resource scenario where you're not getting like a massive increase in your operations, frequency and coverage are often at ends. We can have fewer routes that come more frequently to be more attractive, or we can have more routes covering more of the county spatially, but they're going to be, not as frequent in a sort of limited vehicle, limited dollars scenario. So I think with a lot of priorities, that's kind of what we were helping to see. It's not just as simple as we want more of both. Like, yeah, if it's a blank check, you get more of both. So I think that was, if anything, we're just trying to help paint that picture early on that what I'd love to give both if it was pushed into shove, what's more important. If anyone else has thoughts, but.
I have a follow-up question to that. In terms of microtransit, can you tell us, so what were the areas that you were seeing, and there were the two things that would lend it, that would make microtransit most doable in your estimation?
Right, so I do want to just reiterate first that this is just like one way to look at it. These are not like.
Those are not the
that's
ones
right.
that you've decided.
So
Determined.
as a reminder, we looked at our propensity, which tells us like people who need transit, particularly that transit oriented population index of they really need this connection. If they don't have something, they're not able to get anywhere. And then we have potential, which is density. And when both are high, a typical bus route will probably do well because you need typically higher density to get enough ridership to say, oh, there are people nearby who get on at a single bus stop who are trying to make the same pattern. When density gets low, so as we go down, it's like, oh, there's not enough people who are like definitely going down Broadway Street, like we know Broadway's a corridor. If we send it, some people are trying to just make that trip. When density goes down, you have less people, it's gonna be emptier buses. It's gonna be harder, like they're trying to get more diverse places, so it's harder to group them all at a single bus stop to pick them up or drop them off on. And so it's like, maybe that's microtransit, because it's a bit more door to door. It's a smaller vehicle, but we think it'll be less people, so they don't need a huge vehicle. We're not worried about it being full. So that's kind of what this map is trying to display of when the propensity and the density are high, we're getting that purple color of like, relatively, we think fixed route makes more sense here. When propensity is high, the density is low, that pink. We're like, oh wow, we see a lot of people in need, but we're just not seeing the density that typically means a fixed route is gonna do well. That doesn't preclude you from sending fixed route. For example, there's a lot of pink between New Paltz and Kingston. So yeah, we'll probably have a route connecting New Paltz to Kingston. It's not going to not stop in these areas just because they're pink. And it might be, you know what, this local community has a bus stop that takes them to Kingston in one direction, New Paltz in the other, they're covered. Like that meets most of their needs.
And that can bring up the topic of, if you offer a bus service that's reliable, that you know when it's running, maybe it's not running very often, maybe it's 2 trips a day or 2 trips each way a day. But at least it's a connection to get between, then people can start to rely on it if you can identify sort of for instance, like the KPL,
Mhm.
going to the bus and back, that's a longer distance and people can get used to the schedule of it. Are you making sure to look at that where you can incentivize people getting used to taking a route if it actually comes? Because the thing with microtransit is you're generating more trips of a car because they're going out different places with less people in it.
Mhm.
And it has a limitation on how much it can grow and the expense, it can more directly be attached to the growth.
Right. So I think like one thing too is like maybe the service itself is limited to grow, but you know, microtransit can typically, it's context specific, be a more cost-effective way to serve some of these low density areas. So if you have microtransit that's dropping someone off at a bus stop on a fixed route line that you can now operate more frequently, because now you know, like, hey, because we're saving this money, like, you know, these resources, we can run this this fixed route more frequently. You're kind of getting the benefit of the microtransit and the fixed route are working together and supporting each other, because the fixed route also is going to be more compelling and more attractive for the people who live along it, because there are a lot of people who say, I'm not going to wait 3 hours for a bus. Those choice riders, and it's balancing. We want the service to be more attractive and we want to grow ridership, which means we need to look at people who probably have options that we need to sort of convince. And often with microtransit, like, yeah, if they know the schedule, but 3 hours is a long time to ask someone to wait, versus microtransit, depending, like, could be as come as, you know, it comes within 15 minutes of when you call it. Depends on the zone and how many vehicles you're floating. I don't know if I can.
And are you looking at like the system really growing? Because I mean, there's a certain like really basic knowledge that everybody has. We're not getting people opting into the system because it's such a bare bones system. We have no service on, except for the KPL is extremely limited on Sunday. The New Paltz Loop is always being canceled. So we don't, like Sunday service, it's not something that can really, it doesn't incorporate it into anybody's life as something where they can live as fully as somebody with a car. So that's the main reason people don't opt into it. People, like if you see in Kingston, we get these waves of people moving into Kingston, and we've got primed people ready to opt in, not have a car. They've been trained in New York City and they're coming here and they get a car and they resent it because you can barely like just visit in Kingston without a car.
I resent it too.
What?
That's where I resent it too. I
Yeah.
don't like the way they drive.
Yeah.
Too many people on the road.
Right, yeah, we're gonna accommodating them with, it's another way that we have to accommodate people who are moving in. If we're making it that nobody wants to opt into this system. So, I mean, we've got the driver shortage that's always referred to, and now we're gonna have the limitations of trying to figure out how to transition into an electric fleet. But I mean, unless we grow and, you know, for instance, at least in targeted areas, grow like a lot. Like we have every 2 hour services often. I don't think we have anything that's more than once an hour anywhere. Are there anything that comes more than once an hour?
Most of them are an hour headway.
Yeah, and then they take 1 to 2 breaks. Is there anything that takes only 1 break a day? They all take at
They all
least
take
2.
one break, but there's 2 sets of drivers, so you have an AM and
But there are 2 times that
So
service
there's-
stops during the day.
a break. Yes,
Yeah.
not for
So-
all routes. Some of
So-
our routes now don't have, they're seamless, like the yellow, it doesn't stop,
It doesn't have a break in the service?
just in the evening.
Only once.
Yeah.
So they have at least 1 break in service every day. So we've got these, like, we've got really like not a lot of service. So, I mean, I would hope that the goal would be the bare basic, like, need for the system right now. If you have any hope of people opting in New Paltz and Kingston, especially where there's the opportunity to have people opt in, that we need 20-minute service and we need evening service. You need to be able to go out to drinks. You need to be able to live as full a life when there's the density and the mixed use in an area. You should have a full life that as somebody who owns a car, if we're gonna ever opt people in. So if we're not looking at that, then really it's kind of limited value.
We definitely are, but just also we have to, you know, it's the transit network, like the agency is responsibility to cover as much of the county as possible. And so, and we're not, you know, in these scenarios we're planning, they're not gonna be like cost neutral. I don't know what the exact number is that we're looking at yet, but like, okay, 20-minute service in Kingston, even with a slightly increased budget, like where are we gonna, like, whose bus are we taking away?
It'll take a couple years
Yeah,
till,
who's-
till.
What routes, what far out routes are we getting rid of to pay for? Not that we're actually proposing it at the time, but it's just like, it's a trade-off. Are we sacrificing a lot of this coverage for the sake of operating something frequent that would be very attractive to the core? And that's part of where the survey's going on, like it's coverage and frequency, unless you're just willing to write a blank check. It's typically, that's your choice.
We might have an increase in costs for a while, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't
I was
necessarily have to
way of
take it out.
maintaining some
Is,
coverage.
is the bus driver thing, is that being considered something that's like just makes it not possible to rob from Peter to pay for Paul? Or are we, I mean, are we
It's a
looking at?
reality that we're certainly
We're
recognizing.
aware.
Stuff.
Yeah.
And microtransit has and for, I want you to know, I'm totally neutral on it. Microtransit's a part of recommendation.
Yeah, but it was in the RFP, so.
Yeah.
Are you, I mean, are you looking at ways to get more drivers? We had, the county identified when Laura's here now and Phil was here earlier, and they were instrumental in identifying by asking for it to be in the budget. It turned out that it wasn't actually, it was already identified a training opportunity. It's not advertised at all. It's hard for people to know. I mean, there should be right now partnerships happening with the high school, with the BOCES to get kids, and I know that they can't drive till they're a certain age, but that can't be the excuse. You know, you still need to get them to be taking these classes and getting ready for it because they can work at UCAT until they're aged to drive. So getting kids to get into UCAT and planning for the future that way, but also getting into other programs where we get people into the workforce, because it's through the office of, what's the office for? Yeah, and I mean, just the lack of like, they're not doing anything unless they're instructed to.
We send 3 people.
Yeah, 3 people, that's not enough
They
people.
didn't help us.
We didn't pass.
No.
That's my moot point. It doesn't matter if they passed or not. You only said 3, you only said 3 people is the big point.
Not because we didn't try, nobody's coming through the door.
My point is that there needs to be some programs to get more people through the door because nobody knows about it.
And I think it's a very good recommendation. It's
Yeah.
something that I've spoken with Sharon Williams about on numerous occasions about a driving trainer opportunity where we would pay fully for the opportunity to train drivers with the hope that we could retain them. That's the other challenge and the other flip side. You train a driver, after a while, there's no incentive for them to work only for UCAT. They can go anywhere they want, including Walmart, which pays 6 figures to drive a large vehicle for some of the larger employers in the country.
But some things we,
So it's a challenge.
two things is one, you know, again, I'm neutral on microtransit, but because they're smaller vehicles, they can have a lower, they don't require a CDL. So it's possible that's a way to, I don't know if that's actually the solution, but it's possible way, oh, now we can provide access, but now like we have a wider hiring pool and take our CDL drivers and put them on areas we want with more frequent service. Don't know if that's how it would work out. That's one thing. The other is, oh my gosh, I just had it. So it's on my tongue. Just a second. Oh, yeah, when we draw new routes, if we're thinking, you know, we have the opportunity to say, like, yeah, I know a lot of operators currently are doing 8-hour and 10-hour, like, you know, single runs, right? And that's probably for some of them not appealing, or, you know, like, so we can look at, I don't know what we'll be able to do, like, is it possible to get shorter and like, you know, two shifts throughout the day with like a wider break in the middle, like things that maybe make it slightly more attractive. It may not be, it kind of depends on how the route itself is designed, but that's something we can look at. And then finally, when we show these scenarios, the next phase of outreach, we'll be very explicit on like, hey, this, like, we couldn't put this on the road tomorrow, even if we had the money, because it requires more buses or requires more operators. We would make sure the scenarios are equal in that they represent the same increase investment. And we'd also would be very clear on like, for this to happen, you know, we're assuming that we train, you know, additional 12 operators or something. Maybe not to that level of specificity, but I think we'll be very mindful about, we're not telling people like, yeah, we could do this tomorrow if you want. Very clear about the limitations and what we require.
So, and I'm sorry, I got here late. As far as the rollout goes, this is very preliminary right now, but you don't have all of the, okay. And just an observation, the Kingston and New Paltz, routes are very heavily used. They're considered more, you know, our cities, but they also have more transportation. New Paltz has a loop bus, which goes through very frequently, along with it being an intersection of several other bus routes. As did Kingston. I thought I read somewhere we only took over 3 buses. I could have sworn Kingston was bigger than 3 buses.
There's 3 buses and now we only have 2. They made it
Okay.
down, they
So
took it down to 2.
Okay. But if you build it, they will come. I mean, Saugerties is a very large area too. And heavy on the tourism side. So if we're going back to, you know, individuals visiting without transportation, and I'm sure that they would love to go out to Woodstock, are you going to be projecting if the buses were to go into those areas, even into Phoenicia, even if it's just the summer months, that there would be a higher ridership?
Ridership projections, we're not scoped for that. And also they're kind of, they can be squirrely. Even the best methodologies can be, you know, I think you have to take it with a grain of salt. Particularly UCAT being fare free, because a lot of ridership projections, you rely on fares kind of like helping establish like your baseline demand and things like that.
And how do you mean by that?
Like there's a way you can do ridership. I mean, there's multiple ways, but there's a way you use like the elasticity, it's called the elasticity, to kind of measure the impact of a fare increase, like if that would dissuade riders. And I think when fare is 0, it's kind of hard, like when you don't have a very solid baseline to go off of. There are lots of other tools. I do think to a degree you have to take them with a grain of salt, because they're only as good as the exact data you put in. So seen like rapid growth in the last 2 years, and there's not census data that reflects that. You're very limited in terms of how you're going to get a number. And that also, I think, reflects into the, on the 4th piece of that flow chart about what goes to the service planning, that best practice thing. Yeah, we're looking at these data maps, but you know, we were talking about, oh, this area is slated for like massive redevelopment in the next couple of years. That's not shown in any of my maps, but it's like, okay, that's qualitative observation. If we know it's coming, that we can incorporate and we can like consider. So even if there's no like official data projection that X is gonna be way more people. You know, there's the human aspect of service planning, you know, trying to future proof.
And what about along those lines of coordinating with the municipalities? I know that there's a real want for better public transportation in Saugerties. They have their trailways outside of town, so it could be an opportunity to have a better connection for that. And I mean, there's some instances where you got a better host who could support that, like who could like help to further the usage and to you know, municipalities who are willing to do things like in dream scenario, maybe one of them decides to redo their zoning code and allow for more mixed use, and they're really looking at lessening car usage and like those kind of instances where there's a real good host community, and that makes it more of a better bet. Like the colleges, or could they be something that would be, and what about, and so I'm just wondering, like, if this study could really integrate that sort of thing, like, are there opportunities? Maybe Tech City would be something that you've probably already come up with as an example. So, I don't know, I would hope
College is a good one. I mean, we need more kids to go to the local college, otherwise we're paying for Dutchess and Orange County.
yeah,
And transportation's tricky.
right, oh my gosh, and I once picked up a nurse who was at the Kingston Hospital was on Broadway, because she was staying in Ellenville, and the bus system on Google Maps, people in other municipalities get used to being able to check Google Maps, and it's not updated appropriately. It doesn't reflect the actual system, and she was just totally lost. She didn't even know about the thing, and she kind of assumed that there was more service than there is, and so, but like, that's all the people who are visiting the hospitals to work from out of town, who are coming from places where there's more of a robust public transportation system. So maybe the hospitals and the colleges and places that get people from the city, where you've got those already trained to be ready to opt in populations.
Create more hubs.
So
Yeah.
one aspect of the study, like kind of as after we more or less have a final network, is we're like providing technical kind of best practices for promoting a network, especially when you're changing it, if it's a significant change, of just best practices of how you communicate that, how you like design collateral for like timetables and things. So I think that would kind of be a good opportunity to sort of like start fresh, because again, they may not be little changes, maybe, hey, we're drawing new routes from scratch. So it's a good time to kind of like refresh on how the information is presented, how we're able to like transmit the information to Google for that to be up to date. I don't think there's really anything in the scope or like about the work plan about like trying to tell local cities how they can better support transit, like.
Or find local cities who are already, is what I was talking about, who are already ready to support better public transit.
Okay, yeah, and another, I think, point, like the survey, going back to the survey, does ask where people are living, and we're seeing very good like representation across the county, like it's not all Kingston. But that might also help be indicative of, are we seeing like this overwhelming support, Saugerties, that kind of helps strengthen that argument.
There's also going to be a need for us to consider co-location of facilities in the outlying areas as we continue along this path of electrification.
With the regional transit.
And within the county, just to have opportunities for charging these vehicles outside of our central hub is going to be probably needed, and certainly would be helpful. And we're also very cognizant of needs for storage of facilities, and we have one study that has a very specific recommendation for Golden Hill, but we're also looking at other opportunities in the county, and again, to co-locate, not maybe one large facility somewhere, but looking for other opportunities like school buses and school bus depots or highway garages for partnerships there. But I like to think that all of our municipalities are great partners. and working on
But I
this.
mean, they might have some
But some
things.
are certainly more interested in providing transit for their constituents than others. And I think our demographic analysis really, does a good job at identifying those municipalities.
And it also may like, if we like, okay, we're following demographics and we're like that being one of our major inputs, we draw some routes and we see certain municipalities maybe get less service or something, and they come back and they ask, why did this happen during the comment period? Even if we don't maintain a recommendation, it's like, hey, you know, we gave community X less service than community Y. Because community Y has a lot more density and we think can merit that. So, you know, we will have like sort of our justifications and our thoughts on why we make a decision. And so I think that should be an implicit way of saying, you know, yeah, hourly service may be the best we can put in this town, but if it grew and densified, like we can, I think there are those general practices of, yeah, the denser you are, the more transit you can support from a ridership, from a fiscal perspective. And I think that's like in the report that has a lot of data, it spends a bit more time saying how density is like the #1 predictor of transit success.
I don't know if I have anything else.
In the 2012 Nelson Nygaard study, they talked about the value of redundancy, and they were, part of that was talking about anticipating the possible future of better coordinated with, it ended up being City Bus going out of service and UCAT taking over the service, expanding. But they talked about the value of redundancy and taking advantage of routes to cover other routes. And I don't see, what?
Interlining. I think, is
Interlining.
one of the terms they use also.
Okay, I don't see much of that. In UCAT, it's really hard to, and that might just be a better laid out schedules and maybe more of a system-wide map. Are you looking at any of that?
Interlining can be hard to see from the public perspective, like sometimes it's there, but it's hard to see.
It's not there.
Um,
Sorry. Because it's such a hub and spoke, but it is, I mean, there's opportunities, but they're not timed up.
I mean, yeah, yellow interlines with Saugerties, Kingston, Slate.
So the timing isn't good.
Yeah, it's not great, and it certainly doesn't live up to the hopes that we had in 2012. And that was Forrest's report, by the way.
And I think because we're kind of taking a blank there, I'm hesitating to say complete blank slate, because if our route works really well, we don't not merit it. But we can, you know, it's not, oh, we need to maintain most of the ELI exactly how it is and like tweak at the edges. So if there's something that can be fundamentally designed differently, like when you're designing from scratch, it's easier to think of those interlining opportunities as opposed to taking two existing bus routes and saying, okay,
Yeah.
which one's timetable can I switch? Like,
It's certainly on the table, Tanya. I think it needs to be. I mean, when you look at the Broadway corridor, Albany, Ulster Ave, and then also going down into the Hannaford Plaza. I mean, there's a lot of potential for service there. There's a lot of need in those corridors. There's a lot of common destinations in those. It's a relatively straightforward Y-shaped corridor. I would love to see some interlining and more frequent service opportunities. But I think it's worth taking another one.
sorry, would we say, do we mean, I might be thinking of a different thing for interline. We're talking about like having a service, like having service, so like
Yeah, so.
1 hour, 1 hour, it's 30 minutes. Basically,
Yes,
okay.
yes, like a blue, I mean, a lot of these buses and routes, they're all going, several of them are going to have to go down Broadway.
Mhm.
But they're serving different parts of the area. And so if we could just time those maybe a little better. But they're also, we're trying to sync them up so that people can get their transfers. That's, is
Yeah.
very challenging.
That's personally something I would like to see, like, you know, like I said, we haven't solidified what these scenarios are yet, right? But that's something I would like to see of, and this may not be what we go with, but having the transit, especially in Kingston, concentrated on fewer roads, so it could be more like, okay, maybe not every street in Kingston is as close, but now you know, like, hey, this stop has 4 different hourly routes in it,
Yeah.
which means their time right, 15-minute service. But the trade-off there is, okay, are we willing to pull out a lot of roads in Kingston and make a lot of the residents probably walk further? Like that's the.
One thing we definitely could do is make either the yellow or the red, the Broadway route, and the other one be the roundabout route, because now we've got these routes, both of them go out of the way.
They're right behind each other.
And their ridership, at least what we've looked at, looks like the bulk of the ridership is on Broadway. So it's, I think the argument's there, but you have to, you know, there's some people who have a bus stop on their block right now and are gonna be very unhappy if you get rid of it. So, like, you have to, I think you just have to make those trade-offs very clear to the public of what they think we can gain,
Yeah,
but what they have to give up.
So is the bulk of the ridership on Broadway because that's where the buses go? Coming from Port Ewan, I would have to go to Plaza and catch a mall bus.
Well, we even
So
looked,
again, with the duplicity, could it be separated? And can we get one straight up to the mall to connect?
again, all things are on the table, like, we saw most individual routes, like, a lot of them do have the biggest ridership at Kingston Plaza because of the connections. So I think, yeah, it's gonna be a task to tie, like, how many people need to get to the plaza versus they're going there because that's their only connection.
Yeah.
That's gonna be something we kind of have to untie. A bit.
I'm just gonna add more, whenever, we thought about doing the yellow route coming down through Port Ewan and into the mall.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, running that whole 9W corridor,
There's nothing there,
right?
okay.
So
That makes sense.
that's why we cut it through Kingston
Mhm.
to come up Garrigan Drive, because
Okay.
we're actually servicing more people than it would be to, I mean, it's a dead zone from.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, yeah.
as it is now, does every single bus go to Kingston Plaza?
Yeah.
So maybe that would be good to not have to be,
We talked about that this morning of if there are other locations to treat as informal transfer, like, whether they're official transfer points or informal, but
Like
thinking about like how that benefits.
So if I can kind of, I'm gonna steer things towards Mr. Doyle because he's been quiet back there. Yeah, I mean, I did hear you mention, the economic concerns, either tweak the routes and then kind of pull back on other routes because it's the economics of it. But I mean, we've always talked about a Cadillac dream and then backing into whatever we could afford. I think, I'd still like to see that Cadillac dream. And have any of the municipalities, something you had said earlier, did they apply for the Thriving Communities grants, which did include transportation and businesses?
Not
And
that I'm
maybe
aware of.
create, would it be cool to have all these little hubs?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Nobody did.
We have not seen that. And the general focus with respect to municipalities, the county, particularly with respect to transit is that it's the responsibility of the county, not the responsibility of the municipality, which is a little bit different than how Orange County treats transit. As you know, Orange County does not run a coordinated transit system out of the county. They actually run a dial-a-ride buses that are responsible at the local level. At the local level pays the difference between what federal monies are and what the local costs are.
Mhm.
They run 16 or 17 municipalities actually own buses in Orange County. But I think when we started this, we started with a goal statement. And one of the things that's not in that goal statement is we're not trying to save money. Here, we're basically looking at a goal statement that says we're trying to run a more efficient and effective transit system. And I think if you put that at the top of the list of what we're trying to do, then I think we become there's a lot more confidence that we're not trying to do this so that we can sort of save money with respect to the transit system. And there's movements afoot at the legislative level to essentially provide additional resources to transit using the bed tax that's out there. So how that goes, I don't know. But I want to go back to a couple things. One is that I think what Jared says with respect to when you start weighing service coverage versus service frequency, you really need to think about what that means. You almost, given the cost of the system, you almost can't have both. And so how do we make that balance work? And if you're in Cherry, if you're up in, Cherrytown Road in Rochester, the balance works that, greater coverage. If you're in the city of Kingston, you're waiting an hour or an hour and change for a bus, it's more frequent service. So we need to think about how that works relative to both, providing more frequent service, or at least a service frequency that promotes transit in these urbanized areas. And taking a good look at what we can do for coverage in the rural area. But I also think that the driver question that sort of gets tossed around is one of commitment from the county, and it doesn't just apply to drivers. Every service entity, whether it be at the support services for housing, or whether it be people that are involved in incarceration, or whether it be even middle management, is struggling to find staff. And so the thought, one of the things the county is doing is it's engaged right now in a salary study that takes a look at wages to see what those wages are versus what other people pay. And there's a recognition, I think, that we have to do more with respect to what our training goals are. And so that one of the things we are doing right now is investing in putting together the Office of Employment Training, Economic Development, Tourism, and others in a single building in I Park. The county's renting 20,000 square feet out there. Hopefully what that builds is synergy with respect to understanding how those training programs come together. We've also made not only changes with respect to training, but we've also made changes with respect to eligibility. The fact that there's more diversity in terms of trying to hire, the fact that we've sort of eliminated the box that doesn't ask the question about whether you've ever been incarcerated or convicted of a crime, those types of things. But there are other things that come into play with respect to this. So the commitment here certainly from the county executive staff, the commitment from the county executive is to run a more efficient and effective transit system. The concern is my concern, it's not the county executive's concern. My concern is that there seems to be this discussion process that this is the panacea for the problems with respect to the transit system. And I think it's a first step. And I think that the transit system is complicated and it takes a while to change it. It takes a while to change the culture. And it takes a while to essentially get the necessary equipment and personnel to make this change happen. So I know we've asked you to be patient in the past, but I mean, there's a substantial amount of commitment relative to this study and from the legislature itself and certainly from the county executive. So I'm somewhat optimistic, but I also want to basically think that my optimism is tempered with respect to the time it's going to take.
And the time frame on this, we're looking at early
Well, it's not the
January?
completion of the report. I mean, I want you to think that, electric buses, the delivery on bus systems are now in the 2-year, 3-year range. So you need to think about that. I mean, the smaller buses, we can't even order. They don't make them to a certain extent. Moving things around, looking at what it takes to build additional bus stops and do the design work, get the necessary approvals and move those through. Those all take time. And they take resources, and they're not just resources that are available to UCAT. There's resources that are also available to the Public Works Department. There's resources that are available to the Planning Department. We've entered an era where we have at the county level, I think, significant resources. Certainly in my career, I've never seen the amount of resources that the county has at its beck and call relative to. But we also have a lot of needs. We rebuilt, and look how long it took a mental health department. And we're still in the process of building it, right? We're rebuilding other portions of our departments. We have issues with respect to jail personnel. So there's all kinds of things that are pulling this, but we've made a commitment here to transit. I think we're going to continue. I know we'll continue to do this. And the contract with Forest Care has an implementation program associated with it. And we are looking at that implementation program to see where it can go in terms of being phased, so that everything doesn't change at once. That you look at essentially how you phase an approach in, how that works with the resources that we have available, both from an organizational standpoint, as well as from an equipment standpoint. So you have to, there needs to be a bit more patience here, but there is a commitment to transit. And I think we have the right consultant as well.
We did Boston. She affirmed Boston.
We've worked with
Yeah.
Boston, we have an office in Boston and we're supporting the NBTA's redesign. And then I'm based out of our DC headquarters. We're going through Wilmot Metro's full bus network redesign right now, which is a massive undertaking. That a lot of these really big same questions about, because they showed to go back to your point you made about like having a more visionary network and working our way back to what's doable. I think, and that's a conversation our group needs to have later this week, as we start these scenarios, prepare for the public, having not only an assumption of, okay, for now, these assume a 20% increase in resources, but also, like I said, that stuff takes time. So having making sure people think that, oh, this is a flip of the switch tomorrow. At least I think to help set expectations, because it might be that some leaders see, oh, we think with the current trajectory, this could be done within, this isn't a real number, 5 years. And they're like, we want this a lot sooner. And maybe that sparks a dialogue for, okay, how can we make this happen sooner? How can we accelerate this? But I think it's hard to get that kind of action unless they're reacting to something. The same with like, oh yeah, we need more operators, but we almost need to have, hey, to get this service where we see now Broadway having 20-minute service all day, that requires this many extra buses. Like people kind of need to react to like something visual of a vision essentially.
Because it would be
back
nice
those
to have
visions.
like the Boston system where you go and, you're asking for directions and you're driving a car, but they're giving you directions to take train or the bus system,
Mhm.
and I'm like, no, wait, I'm driving. But, to get us to that point, and I mean, I don't want to be reactive, but it certainly feels like more people are on the road now. And it could just be weekenders or whatever, but, I think, I don't want to react to that, but I think if we had, really robust transportation system, even though we're a lot bigger than Boston, as far as, the acreage goes. Yeah, I don't know. And we've been waiting a year.
I'm sorry.
The bid went out in May, no.
I think it's getting a sense of like, we show people like, oh, this is a reimagined network that maybe is more frequent,
Yeah.
which is what we're asked for. This is a cost neutral one. And I think helps people understand like, oh, we want coverage like in BTA, it's gonna take more money. Like we have to kind of educate the public on this is what you can't afford. Because I think sometimes we're changing the routes, they think we're gonna find money out of thin air, right? Like get something crazy. Like then we have to kind of help translate existing spending to show like these are different scenarios that all cost the same. If none of these are acceptable, which is, one you want to build off of with the understanding that you'd like to grow it. But again, it can be very hard to translate. We spend X dollars a year on transit. What that looks like across multiple different, how that can look different.
Yeah. I wish I know, now I have a bunch of teenagers, so I would have been driving all day today.
Ooh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And I kept telling the one, there's a yellow bus from Port UNM, but it's interesting to see, especially for the younger people too, who want to get out and do something. I don't know how to fix it. I mean, I never thought about that void between Esopus and the mall. But it would certainly cut an hour and a half.
Somebody, I was at a table at Ulster County Community College and they lived out in Stony Run. And, the time they had to get to work to go from Stony Run to the mall was like 2.5 hours.
Yes,
It was-
yeah.
I was like, no way, and
Yeah.
In my laptop, you know.
Yeah, that's how it was for me to get to New Paltz. I had to get to Clearwater Road. It was
Yeah,
about
and
2
you
hours.
ended on- It was very specific to her schedule.
Mhm.
You know, if it was, she had to be there an hour earlier, it was a much more efficient time, but, yeah, you're not wrong.
Well, listen, I want to respect everyone's time, especially
Yeah, thank
our
you.
security, and that's the clock's not working.
We don't have 3 minutes?
It's just like, oh my
It's fine,
goodness,
so-
for 2.5 hours?
That clock's fast.
Do we have 3 minutes?
Well, it is 5 to 7, I would like to wrap things
Yeah,
up.
Okay.
it's like the legislature's
If
meeting.
you, if you have further questions, it's a quick question, but we can try to answer it now.
Okay, so, holidays, and pick from with this what you want. Holidays, that there's no service at all for people to get around on holidays. Signage, there's no signage, and when there is signage, it's, you have to have a smartphone to be able to read it. Events, are often, the buses for events are mostly used to alleviate parking, thereby incentivizing driving in. And, flag system versus a stop system. It's on the schedules that it says that New Paltz and Kingston are stop systems, but nobody at dispatch seems to know that. And it's not treated in any way like no flag system in the city of Kingston and New Paltz. That's ignored. It's only in print. So all that stuff.
Okay.
Good suggestions for improvements.
And to think about those things.
Morning as well, and I for one would definitely like to see an improvement in stops, signage, amenities, all types.
Yeah.
And it
Bus shelters.
will also begin with an inventory, which is something.
Identifying them, yeah.
Is that a different grant? Is that a
No,
separate?
well, the county has its own efforts, UCAT in coordination with the county executive's office is working on distributing shelters to municipalities willing to take on maintenance responsibilities. I know that that is currently in existence, but we'll do our own inventory of existing shelters and have some baseline recommendations for them.
Okay.
Yeah, as for calendar, like, we can cost, I think, when we cost things out for our project, we assume like, yes, we can take a look to get a sense of like when we start costing out random hours, by default is there's some sort of service every day of the week, unless you're explicitly like taking out a Saturday or Sunday. But we can be mindful of our recommendations, like if they need to be scaled back. It's not like when I'm drawing a transit route, my default is to try and have it 7 days a week.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't have, we have almost nothing on Sundays, and that's a big problem. That's a way that people who don't have a car are at a disadvantage, put at a disadvantage. Also, they can't visit relatives on holidays.
Right, that's, I think, part of the increased operating, like, that's a
Yeah.
very, I think that's a very small piece of like the budget overall. I think the bigger thing is making sure you have enough operators that some people are willing to give up their holiday.
Mhm.
Like you have a way to cycle through. So that,
Yeah.
you know, it's not all of your operators are missing every holiday.
Right.
But that's a good point.
And at some point, maybe this evening, I don't know, or at some point, I'd like to understand what is going on at New Paltz with that New Paltz loop. I know that the currently, and that's a current thing. And I mean, is that something that's being considered in this? Because there's a claim from UCAT that's the least ridership. And I mean, is it because it's unreliable? And are they is there any connection with the college not funding it anymore because the what's it called?
The town is.
The town is
I
the
thought you were
college
pulling from
aspect
that
stuff,
because there's a duplicate service, so if somebody was out it.
That is.
but it's not really duplicate,
So-
it's
so
a fraction of it.
The real answer is yes.
It's,
When we get multiple call outs in a given day, you have to.
yes, sir.
I'll chime in. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for working on this and great to hear that things are in the works for making some changes. I'm gonna step right out and say, I think once I've traveled UCAT, not that I wouldn't if it were a little bit more convenient, but I just don't. I'm a caseworker. My name is Daniel Woodham. I've worked with Ulster Immigrant Defense Network with immigrants in the town. Almost all of the immigrants that I know do not take the bus because they don't know about it. I would like to tell them about it. I like to say, you see that sign on the side of the street, you can stand right there and catch the bus. You can get this app. I know people could find it on their phones, but I think most people don't know how. And also the physical place on the street, mostly it's not obvious. Like, I don't know where it is. I've lived here, I actually grew up here, and I still don't know where. I know there's a couple of bus stands, you know, in front of the neighborhood center on Broadway. So that's one thing. Another is that people would mostly use it for shopping and for going to work. And a lot of people live on either side of Broadway. A lot of them work out Ulster Ave if they work in the area in Kingston. Yet there is no direct cut through that I'm aware of to tell them, oh yeah, you catch this bus, it'll take you right over to Ulster Ave, you go to Walmart. In fact, they gotta go back to Hanford Plaza to catch a bus to go that way, you know? And that's like, that maybe is one of the easiest things that could be done. I'm guessing, I don't know. Another thing is that, you know, there are people that work in Woodstock, house cleaning, for example. There's a fair amount of people that have Airbnbs in Woodstock, would happily, you know, employ some people here that are all ready to do housekeeping. But there's very few hours, especially on the weekend, that they can take the bus there, and then there's nothing to return until like the nighttime. If they have a half day work, or if they have a whole day work, they might have to wait 2 or 3 hours. Another issue is some people work at a couple of farms across the river, but where, you know, like, I think mostly in Dutchess County, but also in Columbia County. So, you know, where's the bus that could get them, not to Poughkeepsie train station, but to, you know, just across the Kingston-Rhine Cliff Bridge, either to Red Hook or up to Hudson. And maybe I'm just ignorant and I don't know about these opportunities that are there, but I'm thinking this is not a question, but this is my feedback on behalf of lots of people. The other thing I will say is that Kekchi is, and I'm going to say it again, Kekchi, not Quiche, not Quechua, is the indigenous Mayan group in Kingston, is the 3rd largest language after English and Spanish in Kingston. A lot of them have very minimal Spanish and no English. So if we could find, you know, if we're talking about reaching out to community leaders, let's reach out to those people. Let's ask them what could be done differently. Maybe some could even translate some materials into Kekchi for those that do, in fact, read it. Just happens that it's very common for literacy to be the common theme in this population. Very little schooling, like 2nd grade is kind of an average. So those are points of feedback that I would give to, like, make this a better system for everyone, especially the primary stakeholders that, like, wow, most everybody doesn't have a car. And so would probably make a lot of use of it. When it comes to like the micro transit and being able to navigate a device, that's sort of a literacy thing too. It's a technological literacy, and I'm not so sure how many people would be able to access that, but it's worth a try, and maybe the community leaders could actually assist with that. So I'd be happy to give my name, number, I wrote down my email, you know, to link whoever with some community leaders in the immigrant population.
Thank you very much. We
Sure.
appreciate your time and your input. And I would encourage, for those clients that are Spanish speaking to, maybe you could encourage them to fill out a survey as well. And going through the link, you can choose English or Spanish as well, to get their input, regarding the project as well. That would be fantastic. So thank you.
Sure. Well, one thing on that, I don't know if you have the freedom to have a table, but we have a weekly food pantry with 150 to 200 families every Wednesday. And if there was a table and somebody that we could actually help provide to help do some translation, say, hey, get this QR code if they can figure out a QR code. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, to actually fill it out right there when they're getting their food pantry food.
Where's that?
It's at the Holy Cross Santa Cruz Episcopal Church on Pine Grove, right behind Rite Aid.
I'm gonna comment I'm the director at Ulster County Area Transit. We have done, 4 or 5 tablings at the Holy Cross Church for, the Spanish speaking community. We also, once a month, go on the radio station and we have a driver that translates along with the, radio host. So we do try to reach out to those
Great.
communities as much as we can. And, we've been successful. Yeah, I think that our radio shows are successful. They voice their, concerns, complaints, and things that they like about the bus service. But we have been reaching out and doing those tablings.
Thank you. I'm halftime, so maybe I don't know all the details of what you actually do. Is that with La Voz radio show with Marielle?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Good to know.
And then one other point you made about the just general awareness of it, like the public readiness of the information. Things are good about these types of projects when they're really trying to like almost like a blank slate, but it's not just like, oh, it's not limited by super tiny changes. It's a good time to look at overall, like if we're recreating all of the schedules, like a fresh slate, it's a good time to think about, okay, how visible are they? Should we look at, other print media? So I think one of our tasks that we're helping with UCAT is like a memo of best practices, because my firm works transit agencies across the country, with, letting the public know when there are service changes or like good places to distribute like print schedules or things like that. So we will adopt kind of best practices that UCAT or UCTC or others can kind of move forward with on visibility.
Great, thank you.
Jordan?
How does, for transit propensity, how do, like, the places where people want to go, how does that factor into that analysis? I was looking at more like population centers and things, but how does it?
So when we look at propensity, and I can go back as a graphic, we're looking at where the people are, sorry, this is away. Almost there. There. Okay, so while none of these 4 indices that we look at are actually like origin destination data telling us that people are going from A to B, we know from observed other transit networks of where kind of areas are more likely to attract ridership and different types of ridership. So what this diagram, I didn't quite get into as much as I should have. What this sort of infographic in the middle shows is when you're, if you're a transit-oriented population, a member of that group, you are most likely to rely on transit for everything, right? Not just commuters, you don't feel like driving. So not only are you trying to get to where maybe the typical 9 to 5 jobs are, like in downtown, you're also trying to get it to activity centers where the doctor's offices, recreation, or maybe you work a job that's more like a 1-7, like a restaurant or something. So when we look at these, we could say, oh, I see transit-oriented populations like significant groups, like 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let me look at my activity center propensity. I see, oh wow, there's like a huge clustering on Broadway, and a huge clustering up. It's Ulster Avenue by Tech City, right? That's the street. Like, so, I see a lot of the people who are more likely to rely on transit, and I see a lot of the type of areas, the jobs and the activities that are likely to be their destination. So I can't do this analysis for sure, say, oh, they definitely want to go from here to here. But it's telling me I'm connecting an area of high need with an area of a lot of opportunities for those people. So it's kind of like for transit oriented and commuters, that's kind of like our origin of where people are. And in the service activity centers, the employment, that's kind of like, okay, where are they trying to get? And again, that's just one area, because I might see like, oh, a huge area of people who need transit, and I see 2 activity centers that bring up in that 4th index. I'm like, oh gosh, I can only draw 1 bus route, how I connect with both. That's when I maybe look at like the travel habits to see, oh, is there a clear favorite? Or I look at the surveys, did I hear from people that they really want to get to Ulster Avenue more than it will into Broadway. So it's one of multiple things that we kind of layered.
And it's a dance that we'll play, and we've done it before plenty of times. Whenever we start to make alterations to routes, we can try to add in destinations, but then it's gonna take away from service frequency because it's gonna make the route take longer to get there. So we try our best to balance out enough destinations without sacrificing too much frequencies. That's the challenge that we're gonna be facing.
Did that clarify your question?
Think so. I mean, the market analysis, this is the market analysis section, is looking at what types of service would be more appropriate for the area based off of that.
Like where we see certain groups that are more likely.
Like if you were to look at that map or that with the, where's it? So that's a population index. So that's one part of that analysis.
Yeah.
And then there was another map that should, similar, with, yeah, I was looking at the different, what works best for those populations in terms of fixed route or micro transit.
Mhm.
And that also is encompassing the, like, where people want to go.
Like the map, that map itself, not so much. Like that pink and blue map simply takes, is it looks at the propensity or like the more like there to need transit versus are there enough people in the area to support like the density? And it kind of tells me if the need is high, the density is low, maybe look at transit. It's not prescriptive. It's more like, okay, you know, maybe this is, and there might be some areas that show up in the micro transit analysis, but it happens to be a community that's right between Kingston and New Paltz, which we probably want to keep connected with a regular bus line. So it's not like, oh, we're just gonna drive right past those people because they don't have the, you know, traditional fixed route, you know, indicators. Like, no, they would get a stop if they're trying to make these Kingston and New Paltz connection, right? So it's one of the many variables. Like, look at the micro transit, like this area is high micro transit. Do we see travel flows that we can like draw a micro transit zone that meets that? Because it might be, no, they all want to go all the way to Kingston. That's a haul. That's really probably too long for a micro transit service. So that we go back to the drawing board and look at more traditional service. So it's flipping through a lot of different things. Like I sort of said at the end, no one map is going to be like the last word on any of this.
Aside from UCAT, do other providers, like if there's service that's already offered, does that get factored into this? Like, let's say with private bus operators?
We're not, for this study effort, we're focusing solely on UCAT. We're not considering, out of county operators like Adirondack Trailways at this time. That would be more, akin to a regional study that we completed several years ago where we looked at every operator within the 3-county area. That's the Connect Mid-Hudson study, that analyzed that service. But this effort is focused solely on UCAT.
But we do look at, like, we know Poughkeepsie train station, like we know people take that now to catch Metro North of Hampshire. So we do take that, like, oh, we don't, let's send a bus to Poughkeepsie train station if there are trains coming, right? Like, so there will be that sort of high level of making sure they're integrated, okay, but we're not gonna tell Trailways or Amtrak or Metro North, hey, you should put more service on your routes. Like, that's outside of our control, but we can at least contextualize our recommendations so that they make sense with these other providers.
Ulster County Area Transit is the only public transit provider in the 3-county area that actually has authority to run outside of this county. So we run to Newburgh and Poughkeepsie. And there is potential to run to other destinations if demand necessitates outside of.
I don't want to hog the floor, but I have other questions. So anyone else have?
Let me just check in. Are we good on
There's
Zoom?
no one on the line.
Okay, please.
Funding for, you know, these scenarios. I mean, is that, how do you take into consideration like projections of funding? Is that going to increase, decrease? You know, you're talking about making changes and presumably in expansion of some type, probably not retraction. or contraction?
Cost is definitely going to be a factor. That's a very good question, and it's something that can't be ignored. We have a lot of resources in Ulster County when compared to some of its equivalent counties in the area, spends significantly more of its county dollars to support the system. Other counties use strictly federal and state resources and the minimum required county match in order to run their systems. We're spending much more than the minimum match today, at the moment. Through the Ulster County Legislature and the county executive, they've made a pledge to, and I'm not sure what the status of this is, to pass a bed tax, to increase the bed tax for hotel stays. And a portion of that funding, County Executive Metzger has pledged, would go to enhancing transit service. We also have significant federal dollars that are called formula dollars that are available presently that we're spending down. We have a backlog of those dollars that go to buses. But ultimately, I mean, that's the very long response. I've personally done a projection 20 years, 25 years into the future, and there are significant gaps. If we just maintain existing service, there will be further cost deficits out when we project out into the future. They will have to be made up somehow. So there are limiting costs as a limiting factor. There's no doubt.
It's not a new story with providing public transportation in Ulster County.
Right. But it is under the current administration, a high priority, the administration. Part of the purpose of the study is to really focus on those areas where we can continue to try to increase ridership and where people really want to have transit. And then another part of it is to find ways to provide transit where there's less demand, but continue to provide a service that meets the needs. I really don't see, well, we'll see. But yeah, cost is definitely a factor. And that will be addressed in our subsequent steps to go through.
And those scenarios we talked about, whatever their cost assumption is, like will be, like if they assume increasing cost, or maybe like, even if the cost part's not an issue, like it would take a couple of years for that to be feasible, whether just like hiring the correct number of operators and stuff. We would be very explicit about like, this is a potential like 2030 network, maybe, I don't know the year yet. And we'd want to make sure that those two scenarios represents the same amount of resources. So we're not saying, hey, pick less or more, because most people are going to pick more. The idea is like in these otherwise equal scenarios, do we want to do something that's more contingent on micro transit and something that's not? Or, you know, something that's more routes versus less, like they'll be equal in terms of their budget.
We know we have fixed routes, but there are very few riders. And so when it comes down to the analysis, that's an extremely high cost to run a bus with a driver to serve a small amount of people. So those are areas where we're probably going to try to think of some alternatives. Can it continue to serve the populations and communities, but maybe we can find something more efficient. Are there any other questions, Bill? Go on, Mr. Erner.
Yeah, Phil Erner. I am a former county legislator. I worked a lot with about half of you, at least in the room, on transit issues. It was one of my top legislative areas. I was on the Public Works Committee for my second 2 years I served. Thank you for your presentation. I'm also one of the co-founders of a 5-year-old organization, the Riders of Ulster Transit Alliance. And I think I could say representing them here. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm representing, but I'm also involved in a survivor of traffic violence and traffic safety advocacy organization called Safe Pass Ulster that also advocates for transit as a safer alternative to everybody motoring around by themselves. Cars. Couple things. Ulster County Transportation Council has a responsibility that's ongoing to survey the public about their various programs so that they get the funds and so forth and so on. And I was able to look back during my time in office for over a decade of material that they had, surveys that they had done, and data that they've collected from riders. And a lot of recommendations were provided that I have not seen implemented yet. So I recommend to you to go back and look at those, see what they were, try and understand why they might not have been implemented. There's also, I've learned from my own bus riding and from my work with constituents about various needs, like for example, a petition that was delivered 10 years ago by 50 riders of the X route, that's between New Paltz and Newburgh, that asked, can you have weekend service? And the petition was delivered again a couple years later, a third time. That still hasn't happened. In my experience, the transit dependent population of Ulster County, not let alone the 12.5% or so of households that don't have a car and that may not actually be able to get around at all because the bus doesn't go where and when they need it to, are extremely disfranchised. And so one of the best ways to find out about that is, as Daniel was pointing out, and I'm glad to hear that you do go to the Ulster Immigrant Defense and have tables there and stuff, but going to the communities where you know folks are that aren't riding, don't have cars or currently aren't riding the bus, might have high needs. Another such group of communities, I would say, are the folks living in temporary emergency housing and social services that are all quite far flung around the county, and even outside the county sometimes. That's often been the most, folks are the most desperate because they've been displaced from their home. They're still working, they still need to go to all their appointments, get back to DSS, and DSS is not always willing or able to provide them a ride. But we know where those motels are. I assume you could go to the social service department, and if they can't disclose to you because of privacy reasons, at least you could say, hey, could you put a survey to your motel locations? And, or even send somebody there like they do at the Kingston Motel now regularly to find out what the need is. Now there is a shuttle from there. Yeah, I guess that's I mean, holidays, the fact that there's no buses on a lot of holidays throughout the year. There's very few buses on Sundays. There's been a request for a bridge bus for years over the Kingston Rhinecliff Bridge, and let's get Dutchess County involved. Let's get our state assembly senator involved. They span the bridge for their district. That bridge collects tolls, but the last time the public could get across that bridge in some form of mass transit was when there was a ferry and before there was a bridge, like over 60 years ago. That's crazy. So, and you know, the connections Daniel mentioned, other counties too. We border on Sullivan, they have a transit system. We border on Greene, they have a transit system. I was trying to figure out how can I go from Kingston to Albany without paying the ridiculous fare on trailways. And it would take like, you'd have to leave around 4 in the morning and catch, you know, the first bus up. And depending on the day and the time, it's very difficult to do that. But I think a regional, I like that a regional approach was mentioned. I understand that there's limitations when a county runs its own transit system versus an authority that has a regional purview. So I guess in summary, I'm glad to see how many survey responses you got. That seems really great. And those are some ideas of where else to find additional information. And yeah, thanks. I'll continue to follow along.
Appreciate you. Look at those connections. I mean, at the end of the day, I think one of the biggest things is often to get people more frequent service, either it's gonna go in those areas or you have to say I'm getting frequency, but like it will necessitate like a transfer, right? And that's, you know, right now, a lot of these routes are time transfers. So if you have to miss that, it can be, you know, very inconvenient. That's like, I think one of the things we want to help the public understand is kind of this trade-off right now. Like, you know, this, you could have a single bus line that connects Kingston to every single community in the county. But like, bit of resource, even increased resources in somewhat limited scenario, like those are gonna be very infrequent bus lines versus, hey, I could probably get you something more frequent, but we're gonna need you to transfer somewhere else or something. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, of kind of possibly how we approach the scenarios of, are people willing to make that trade-off? Because we could possibly give them more coverage, but like, you know, something has to give to make that feasible.
And I would say to your point regarding previous studies, and we're certainly aware of previous studies and they do have some direct relevance to our efforts. But I think the unique thing about this effort is that it recognizes the monumental disruptions that occurred in a relatively short period of time, since 2019. Some of them self-caused, the merger between City Bus and UCAT being a big one, some changes in leadership at UCAT, the driver shortage, which is a national disruption, demographic changes that we've had here in Ulster County and the Hudson Valley. I mean, the list goes on. All of these, I think, factor into a need to just, let's wipe the slate clean and start fresh and re-engage with the public and say, okay, what do you need in the system? And we will definitely see how that aligns with some of our previous efforts, and hopefully it will align with some of our previous efforts, but I'm expecting to hear some good things.
Pandemic really changed, and we've seen this, I've seen this everywhere, really changed a lot of people's concept of mobility, like with, you know, many larger cities, transit agencies are like having to combine or just discontinue like commuter routes because people don't commute 9 to 5 every day like they used to. And more people like pandemic really did change a lot. We're seeing transit bounce back, and bus transit nationally has actually been bounced back a lot more than rail. But people's travel patterns have changed across the country. So that doesn't mean that like, oh, the previous studies are not relevant, because they are, but it really does challenge, I think, some of our, like Brian said, like fundamental assumptions of how we did this even 5 years ago compared to what we need to provide now.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? We're gonna be sticking around. I don't want to keep people here any longer than we need to, although the air conditioning is gonna be really nice. So you're welcome to stick around. We have a second session at 5:30 as well. So we'll be here for quite a while. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, thank you.
Again, please put your information on the sign-in sheet if you haven't already, and we can add that for future notifications.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So is the trick to have you log in first?
How do you know
And
time?
then, have Jared log in.
Through